A mountain man was still a virgin at 46, until a bleeding virgin collapsed at his gate. Snow howls through the Colorado mountains as a lone man steps out of his cabin, then freezes. There, in the drift, lies a woman, bloodied, half dead, whispering one word: safe. He takes her in, praying he's not breaking his vow. But by morning, riders thunder up the trail, demanding the girl he's hidden inside. To save her life, he tells the one lie that changes everything. She's my wife. Now the whole territory wants answers. Who is this wounded bride? Why are men of the cloth hunting her like an outlaw? And what secret buried in the snow could damn them both, or redeem them forever? As the church bell tolls and the noose tightens, will a man who's never known love risk his soul to protect it, or lose everything trying? Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered hollow as Joshua Boone's axe bit deep into another log. The steady rhythm of his work echoed off the surrounding mountains, a familiar chorus that had marked his days for more years than he cared to count. Pausing to wipe the sweat from his brow despite the biting cold, he studied the growing pile of split wood beside his cabin. "Reckon that'll do for now," he muttered, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of more snow. Dark clouds gathered overhead, their heavy bellies threatening to unleash winter's fury across the Colorado wilderness. Joshua gathered an armload of split logs, the rough bark catching on his wool shirt as he carried them toward the cabin's covered porch. The day was dying fast, earlier than usual with the storm rolling in. He'd need to bring in extra wood before full dark settled. The sudden burst of barking from his dogs stopped him in his tracks. Buck and Scout rarely raised an alarm without cause. They knew every deer and elk that passed through the hollow, treated the occasional bear with respectful wariness. This was different. Their barks held urgency, warning. Setting down his load of wood, Joshua reached for the lantern hanging by the cabin door. His fingers, stiff from hours of work, fumbled with the matches before catching the wick. The yellow flame sputtered to life inside its glass cage. "What is it, boys?" he called out, holding the lantern high as he made his way toward the gate where his dogs continued their frantic barking. The wind whipped harder now, driving tiny needles of snow against his face. The sight that greeted him nearly stopped his heart. A woman lay crumpled in the snow, face down, her calico dress torn and stained dark in places that made his stomach clench. Buck and Scout circled her prone form, their barks softening to worried whines. "Dear Lord," Joshua breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. Snow had already begun collecting on her thin dress and in her dark hair. When he pressed tentative fingers to her neck, he found her skin cold, but a pulse still fluttering beneath. Without hesitation, he slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees, lifting her as carefully as he could. She was slight in his arms, barely more than a girl, and the thought of what might have brought her to this state made his jaw tighten with anger. The dogs followed close as Joshua carried her to the cabin, nudging the door wider with his boot. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting weak shadows across the rough-hewn walls. He laid her gently on his bed, the only proper place for an injured woman, and hurried to stoke the flames back to life. As warmth began to fill the single room, Joshua got his first clear look at his unexpected guest. Her youth struck him first. She couldn't be more than 23 or 24 years old. Despite the dirt and blood on her face, her features held a delicate beauty that made him suddenly conscious of his calloused hands and threadbare surroundings. A soft moan escaped her lips, and her eyelids fluttered. "Safe," she whispered, the word barely audible before she slipped back into unconsciousness. Joshua ran a hand through his graying hair, acutely aware of the impropriety of having a young woman in his home. But the storm was closing in fast, and the nearest town was 10 miles away, an impossible journey in these conditions. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice rough with emotion, "guide these hands to help your child. Keep her safe through this night." Moving with purpose now, he hung his largest pot over the fire and filled it with clean snow to melt for water. While it heated, he gathered what supplies he could. Clean rags torn from his oldest shirt, the tin of healing salve his mother had taught him to make from pine resin and herbs, a cup of water for when she woke. The woman's breathing remained shallow but steady as Joshua began the delicate task of cleaning her visible wounds. There was a nasty cut above her right eye, and her hands were scraped raw, as if she'd fallen repeatedly during a desperate flight. Each injury he discovered fed a growing anger in his chest, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand, working with trembling reverence to avoid causing her any further pain. Buck and Scout settled by the door, their watchful eyes moving between Joshua and the stranger on his bed. The wind howled louder outside, rattling the cabin's windows and driving snow through every tiny crack. They were well and truly isolated now, cut off from the world by nature's fury. As darkness claimed the hollow completely, Joshua sat in his chair by the fire, watching the steady rise and fall of the woman's chest. Questions tumbled through his mind. Who was she? What had happened to her? What sort of evil had driven her to flee through the wilderness in such weather? The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Joshua pulled his mother's worn Bible from its shelf, letting it fall open to the Psalms she'd read to him as a child. But his eyes kept drifting back to his unexpected guest, his heart heavy with the weight of responsibility and concern. "Lord," he whispered, his words barely louder than the storm outside, "what have you brought to my gate?" The woman slept on, her face peaceful now in the firelight, while outside the snow continued to fall, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of white silence. Joshua settled deeper into his chair, knowing sleep would elude him this night. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for now his duty was clear: to watch, to pray, and to protect this stranger whom God had placed in his care. Buck lifted his head suddenly, ears pricking forward at some sound only he could hear, but after a moment he relaxed again, laying his muzzle back on his paws. The fire popped, sending another shower of sparks up the chimney, and Joshua pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. It would be a long night, but he would keep his vigil, watching over this wounded soul who had collapsed at his gate, like some wild bird broken by the storm. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's frosted windows, casting weak shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Ayla stirred beneath the heavy quilt, her eyes fluttering open to unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, consciousness returning in fragments, the cold, the pain, the desperate flight through endless snow. The blanket clutched tight against her chest. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing at the protest of bruised muscles. Strange walls, strange bed, the crackle of a dying fire. Fear clawed at her throat until her gaze fell upon the figure seated in a chair by the hearth. A man, older than herself, his head bowed in what appeared to be sleep. The slight movement of her rising caught his attention. Joshua's eyes opened, weary from his night's vigil, and he straightened in his chair. "You're safe," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "Don't be frightened." Ayla pressed herself against the wall behind the bed, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The man's words were gentle, but she'd learned how quickly gentleness could turn to violence. Water? Joshua offered, lifting a tin cup from the table beside him. He made no move to approach, sensing her fear like a tangible thing between them. You've been through quite an ordeal. She studied him carefully, the gray threading his dark hair, the weathered lines of his face, the careful distance he maintained. Something in his awkward manner, the way he held himself with such deliberate restraint, eased a fraction of her terror. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat raw. Joshua stood slowly, telegraphing each movement as he placed the cup on the corner of the bed within her reach. She took it with trembling hands, the water cool and clean on her parched tongue. "I'm Joshua Boone," he said, retreating back to his chair. "Found you collapsed by my gate last evening. Storm was too fierce to fetch help from town." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You spoke once, said you were safe. Are you being pursued?" The cup shook in Ayla's grip, water sloshing over the rim. "I didn't mean—" Her voice broke. "I never wanted—" "Take your time," Joshua said quietly. "No one will harm you here." Tears spilled down her cheeks as the words finally came. "It was my wedding day," she began, the memory sharp as broken glass. "At the revival camp, Brother Daniel's son, Thomas, I was his intended bride. But I couldn't. When the time came, I couldn't say the words." Joshua's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "Thomas found me after, behind the prayer tent. Said I'd shamed him, that I belonged to him now, wedding or no." Ayla's fingers traced the torn edge of her dress. When he wouldn't stop. There was a lantern. It broke in the struggle. I cut him on the arm. There was so much blood." She drew a shuddering breath. "I ran. They were shouting, calling me possessed, violent. I just ran and ran until I couldn't anymore." "Dear Lord," Joshua muttered, rising to stoke the fire. The familiar task helped him master the rage building in his chest. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing." "You don't understand," Ayla said. "Brother Daniel's revival. They'll say I attacked his son without cause, that I'm filled with evil spirits. They'll find no welcome here," Joshua said firmly, though his heart hammered at the thought of confrontation. He crossed to an old trunk in the corner, lifting out a worn shawl of soft gray wool. "This was my mother's. You must be cold." Ayla accepted the shawl, wrapping it around her shoulders. The simple kindness of the gesture broke something loose inside her, and fresh tears fell. "I don't even know where I am." "Thunder Ridge," Joshua replied. "My cabin's set apart from most folks, thank the Lord, 10 miles to the nearest town." He glanced out the window at the snow-covered hollow. "You rest. I need to split more wood before the day grows warm and the snow softens." Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. Joshua paused on his porch, letting his eyes adjust to the brightness of sun on fresh snow. That's when he saw them, tracks leading away from his gate toward the valley road. Horse prints, at least 3 sets, partially filled with fresh snow. His stomach clenched. Someone had passed in the night, searching. They'd likely return once the snow melted enough to make travel easier. Joshua's legs carried him to the chopping block, but instead of reaching for his axe, he found himself sinking to his knees in the snow. "Lord," he whispered, bowing his head, "give me wisdom before they come." The sound of his dog's soft whining drew his attention back to the cabin. Through the window he could see Ayla still wrapped in his mother's shawl, her face turned toward the light. Something stirred in his chest, not the forbidden attraction he'd feared, but a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Rising from his knees, Joshua gripped his axe handle with new purpose. The girl needed time to heal, time to find her strength again. If the Lord had guided her to his gate, then surely he would show the way forward. Until then, Joshua would do what he could: split wood, keep watch, and pray for the wisdom to face whatever challenges the day might bring. The rhythmic thunk of his axe soon filled the hollow, steady as a heartbeat. While inside the cabin, Ayla drew his mother's shawl closer around her shoulders and watched the sun climb higher over the snow-covered mountains. The late morning sun had barely warmed the air when Joshua heard it: the distant thunder of hoofbeats climbing the snow-covered slope. His hands stilled on the kettle he'd been filling, water droplets freezing on his fingers as he listened. Ayla must have heard it too. She appeared in the bedroom doorway, face pale as new milk. "They've come for me." Joshua crossed the cabin in 3 long strides, his mind racing. "The root cellar," he said, pulling up the trapdoor hidden beneath a worn rug. "Quickly now." The underground space smelled of earth and stored vegetables, barely tall enough for a person to crouch. Ayla descended the rough-hewn steps without hesitation, her borrowed shawl catching on a splinter. Joshua helped her settle between barrels of salted pork and winter apples. "Whatever you hear," he whispered, "stay silent as a prayer." She nodded, eyes wide in the dimness. He covered the opening with the rug, smoothing it carefully before returning the kitchen chair to its place. The horse's hooves grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of tack. Joshua forced himself to move slowly, naturally, as if this were any ordinary morning. He added wood to the fire, straightened his collar, and waited. The knock, when it came, rattled the cabin door on its leather hinges. Joshua counted to 3 before opening it, squinting as if the brightness bothered his eyes. 2 men sat astride their horses, their mount's breath steaming in the cold. The one on the left wore a deputy's badge that caught the sunlight. The other, younger and sharp-featured, carried a rifle across his saddle. "Morning, friend," the deputy said, though his tone held little friendship. "We're searching for a woman fled from Reverend Kellen's revival camp 2 nights past. Dark hair, young, wearing a torn calico dress. Seen anyone matching that description?" Joshua leaned against the doorframe, affecting the easy manner of a man with nothing to hide. "What's she done?" The younger man spat into the snow. "Tried to murder the Reverend's son with a broken lantern. Stole money from the ministry coffers, too." "That so?" Joshua kept his voice, level, despite the lie's bitter taste. "Sounds serious." "Very serious," the deputy agreed. "Trail led this way before the storm. Any strangers pass through?" Joshua met their eyes steadily, praying his next words wouldn't damn his soul. "You're too late. The only woman on this ridge is my wife." The deputies exchanged glances. The younger one's hand tightened on his rifle. "Your wife? Folks in town say you live alone." "Folks in town mind other folks' business too much," Joshua replied. "Got married last month in Silver Creek. Papers are all proper if you're wanting to see them." The deputy studied him for a long moment. "We'll be verifying that claim, Mr. Boone, Joshua Boone." "Well then, Mr. Boone, you have yourself a good day." The deputy touched his hat brim. "Though you might want to mention to your wife that honest folk don't hide from the law." They wheeled their horses around, hooves cutting fresh tracks in the snow. Joshua watched until they disappeared down the slope, before closing the door and sagging against it, his heart hammering beneath his wool shirt. When he lifted the trap door, Ayla was shivering in the root cellar's chill. He helped her up, steadying her when she stumbled. "They've gone," he said softly. "I heard." Her voice trembled. "You told them I was your wife." "I did." Joshua stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they stood. "It was wrong to lie, but I couldn't." He swallowed hard. I couldn't let them take you back there. Tears welled in her eyes. They said I tried to murder Nathan, that I stole money. None of it's true. I know. Joshua's hands clenched at his sides. The Lord knows too. But now you've tied yourself to my trouble. Ayla wrapped his mother's shawl tighter. They'll come back asking questions. Let them. The fierce certainty in his voice surprised them both. We'll face it together if you're willing. Unless... He hesitated. Unless you'd rather try for somewhere safer once the snow clears. Ayla shook her head. There's nowhere safer than here. She glanced around the cabin at the neat shelves and swept floors. I can help, earn my keep. I know how to cook and clean, tend gardens come spring. You don't need to earn anything, Joshua said gruffly, but company would be welcome. The rest of the day passed in careful movements around each other, like wary deer sharing the same meadow. As evening drew near, Ayla noticed Joshua struggling with a torn shirt sleeve. Let me, she said, taking the worn garment from his calloused fingers. She found needle and thread in his mother's old sewing basket, the familiar task settling her nerves. They sat in companionable silence as the lamp burned lower, casting soft shadows on the log walls. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, thick flakes dancing past the window glass. Joshua watched them, lost in thought, until Ayla's quiet voice drew his attention. Why did you help me? She asked, her needle pausing mid-stitch. You could have turned me away, saved yourself this trouble. Joshua considered his answer carefully. My mother used to say, every stranger at your gate is Christ in disguise, testing your heart. He smiled faintly. Though I reckon she never imagined a test quite like this. Ayla tied off her thread and handed back the mended shirt. Their fingers didn't quite touch in the exchange, but something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or the first fragile thread of trust. Later, after Ayla had retired to the bedroom and Joshua had made his bed by the banked fire, he stood at the window watching the thickening snow. His breath fogged the glass as he whispered, So now I have a wife, though heaven knows I never touched her hand. The words hung in the stillness, a prayer and a promise both. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of white silence, while inside, two souls bound by circumstance and compassion drifted toward sleep, each wondering what tomorrow might bring. The blizzard gripped the mountain hollow like a white fist, wrapping Joshua's cabin in layers of deepening silence. 3 days had passed since the deputy's visit, and still the snow fell, nature's curtain drawing them away from the world's watching eyes. Joshua woke each morning before dawn, stoking the dying embers and stealing glances at Ayla's sleeping form near the hearth. She'd insisted on making her bed there, leaving him his mother's old room despite his protests. The arrangement felt both proper and painful, her presence just feet away, yet bounded by invisible walls of propriety. On this fourth morning, he watched her stir beneath the quilts as he pulled on his boots. Her dark hair spilled across the pillow, and something caught in his chest at the sight. Shaking it off, he grabbed his traps and headed out into the pale dawn. The snow had drifted shoulder-high in places, but Joshua knew every fold of his land by heart. He checked his trap lines with practiced efficiency, finding 2 rabbits caught in the night. Their frozen bodies would make a decent stew, at least. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, the cabin's interior had transformed. Warmth and order radiated from every corner. Ayla moved between stove and table, her borrowed dress swishing softly as she worked. The smell of cornbread filled the air. You didn't have to cook, he said gruffly, though pleasure warmed his voice. I want to help." She took the rabbits from him without flinching. "I know how to dress these, if you'll let me." Joshua nodded, surprised. "Learned that at the revival camp?" "No." Her hands moved surely with the knife. "Before that, when Mama was alive, we lived rough some years." He watched her work, noting how she wasted nothing. "You don't talk much about before. Neither do you." But her tone held no accusation, only quiet understanding. They fell into a rhythm as the days passed. Joshua would work outside, chopping wood, checking traps, fighting, back the endless snow. Inside, Ayla brought life to spaces long neglected. She found his mother's old broom and swept away years of dust. Her needle mended tears in his clothes that he'd grown used to ignoring. And she sang. The first time he heard it, Joshua nearly dropped his axe. The sound drifted through the cabin walls, clear and sweet as spring water. He recognized the hymn, "Come, thou fount of every blessing." His mother had sung it while kneading bread or quilting by the fire. He stood listening, axe forgotten in his hands, until the song faded. When he entered the cabin, Ayla glanced up from her mending, cheeks pink. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. "Singing helps pass the time." "My mother," his voice caught. He tried again. "She used to sing that one." Ayla's eyes softened with understanding. "Would you rather I didn't?" "No." He hung up his coat with careful movements. "It's good to hear singing again." That evening, as snow whispered against the windows, they shared rabbit stew and cornbread by the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the log walls, creating a pocket of warmth that felt separate from the world outside. "Why did you never marry?" Ayla asked suddenly, then flushed. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." Joshua studied his bowl for a long moment. "Made a promise," he said finally. "To my mother, before she passed." Ayla waited, her face open and free of judgment. "She worried about me up here alone." He set his empty bowl aside. "Made me swear I'd stay pure until marriage. Said it would protect me from wrong choices." "And you kept that vow?" Her voice held wonder rather than mockery. Joshua nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Never even held a woman's hand, truth be told. Folks in town think I'm touched in the head for it." "I think it's beautiful." The quiet sincerity in her voice made him look up. "To honor your mother that way, to keep faith even when it's hard." Something eased in his chest, a knot of shame he hadn't known he carried. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower. Later, after Ayla had settled onto her pallet by the hearth, Joshua lit the lamp and opened his mother's old Bible. The pages fell naturally to James chapter 2. His voice shook slightly as he read aloud, "Mercy triumphs over judgment." The words seemed to hang in the fire-lit air. He thought of the deputies, of their harsh judgment of Ayla, of his own initial hesitation to help her, of how mercy had led him to lie, his first real sin in years. "Do you regret it?" Ayla's whisper barely carried across the room. "Helping me?" "No." The answer came without thought. "Whatever comes, I don't regret it." She was quiet so long he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, "I dream about them finding me." Her voice trembled. "About being dragged back there." Joshua closed the Bible, his jaw tightening. "Don't fret about that. You're safe here." "Promise?" The word was small, vulnerable. "I promise." He meant it with every fiber of his being. Outside, the snow continued its relentless fall, building walls of white between them and the world. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and Ayla's breathing gradually steadied into sleep. Joshua remained awake, watching shadows play across the ceiling. He heard her stir, caught the whispered words that slipped from her dreams. "Don't send me back." His jaw clenched, hands fisting in his quilt. It wasn't just a promise anymore. It was a covenant. Whatever came down that mountain trail when the snow cleared, he would keep her safe. The Lord himself would have to strike him down before he'd let anyone drag her back to that false preacher's camp. He fell asleep to the sound of her quiet breathing, while beyond the cabin walls, the snow kept falling, sealing them in their fragile sanctuary of trust and shared solitude. The weather broke on the 5th morning, sunlight piercing through thinning clouds like fingers of grace. Joshua stood at his cabin door, watching the crystalline landscape sparkle beneath the new light. The silence felt different now, expectant rather than isolating. He heard Ayla's soft footsteps behind him before she spoke. "The storm's finally passing." "Reckon so." He didn't turn, his eyes fixed on the valley trail below. They both knew what clear weather meant. Visitors would come. As if summoned by their thoughts, a horse's whinny echoed up the slope. Joshua's shoulders tensed as he spotted the rider, a man in a heavy coat, a silver badge catching the morning sun. "Stay calm," he murmured to Ayla. "Let me do the talking." The marshal's horse picked its way carefully through the snow, steam rising from its flanks. The rider dismounted at the gate, his movements deliberate. Joshua recognized the careful way he held himself. This was a man who'd seen trouble and learned to approach it slowly. "Morning," Joshua called out, stepping onto the porch. "Mighty cold ride up here." The marshal nodded, one hand resting near his gun belt. "Joshua Boone? I'm Marshal Daniel Hayes." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Mind if I step inside? Got some matters to discuss?" Joshua's heart hammered, but his voice remained steady. "Come on in. Wife's just put coffee on." Inside, Ayla stood by the stove, her hands clasped tightly before her. She'd dressed carefully in one of Joshua's mother's old dresses, her hair neatly braided. To any eye, she looked every inch a mountain man's wife, if you didn't notice how her fingers trembled. The marshal settled into the offered chair, accepting a tin cup of coffee. His eyes moved between them, taking in details. The single bed visible through the bedroom door, Ayla's pallet by the hearth, the way they kept their distance from each other. "Got news from down valley," he said finally, "about Reverend Kellen's son." Joshua felt Ayla stiffen behind him. "He survived," the marshal continued, watching their reactions. "Pretty badly burned, though. Says a woman attacked him with a lantern. Tried to kill him when he caught her stealing from the ministry's strongbox." "That's not," Ayla began, but Joshua's slight headshake silenced her. The marshal unfolded his paper. "Got a wanted notice here. Says to look for a young woman named Ayla Carver. Dark hair, blue eyes, about 5'4". He looked directly at Ayla. "Matches your description pretty close." Joshua stepped forward, placing himself between them. "My wife's name is Ayla Boone. We've been married near 6 months now." "That so?" The marshal's voice was neutral. "Funny, nobody in town seems to recall a wedding." "We kept it quiet, just us and the Lord as witness." The marshal sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch. Finally, he set the cup down with a soft clink. "Here's how I see it. Either you're lying to protect a fugitive, which is a serious offense, or you're telling the truth. Either way, there's questions need answering." He stood slowly. "I'll be back within the week to escort you both to town for proper inquiry." Joshua's hands clenched at his sides. "The pass is still dangerous. Weather's clearing. Trail should be passable in a few days." The marshal moved toward the door, then paused. "Word of advice? If you are married, might want to start sharing that bed before the inquiry. Town gossips noticed things like separate sleeping arrangements. After he'd gone, the cabin felt colder somehow. Isla stood frozen by the stove until the sound of hoofbeats faded, then crumpled to the floor with a sob that tore at Joshua's heart. "My life is over," she whispered, hugging herself. "They'll believe Nathan. His father has influence with every judge in 3 counties. Joshua knelt beside her, careful not to touch, but close enough that she could feel his presence. "Listen to me. God's truth has a way of coming to light. We just have to trust in his timing." She looked up at him, tears tracking down her cheeks. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen his hand in this from the start." Joshua's voice grew fierce with conviction. "He didn't lead you to my gate just to abandon you now." Ayla wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "I can't just sit here waiting. I'll go mad thinking about it." "Then we'll work." Joshua stood, offering his hand. "Chores need doing. Snow or no snow." She took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. The touch lingered a moment longer than necessary. Then they both stepped back, faces flushing. The afternoon found them hauling water from the creek, where the ice had begun to crack in the strengthening sun. Joshua showed Ayla how to test the ice's thickness, how to break it safely with the iron rod he used. They worked together, passing buckets between them, their movements falling into a natural rhythm. "Like this?" Ayla asked, mimicking his careful steps across the slippery bank. "That's it." Joshua steadied the bucket as she filled it. "You're a quick study." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Had to be, growing up. Mama said I was born running before I could walk." The mention of her mother made her smile fade, but she kept working, her determination visible in every line of her body. Joshua found himself watching her more than the task, struck by how naturally she fit into his world. The way she anticipated his movements, how she'd learned the little tricks of mountain life without complaint. They finished as sunset painted the snow in shades of rose and gold. Both were tired, but satisfied with the day's work. Inside, they washed up in comfortable silence, sharing the warmth of the stove. "Would you pray with me?" Ayla asked suddenly, her voice small but steady. Joshua looked up, surprised. They'd each prayed separately since she'd arrived, maintaining that last boundary between them. "You sure?" She nodded, extending her hand. After a moment's hesitation, he took it, and they knelt together by the hearth. "Dear Lord," Ayla began, her voice gaining strength, "we come before you with heavy hearts but trusting spirits." Joshua's deeper voice joined hers, their words weaving together like threads in a tapestry. They prayed for guidance, for protection, for truth to prevail. But mostly they prayed for strength. Strength to face whatever lay ahead with faith rather than fear. When the final Amen faded, neither moved immediately. Their joined hands had become an anchor, a physical reminder that whatever came, they would face it together. Finally, Joshua gave her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Best get some rest. Tomorrow brings its own trials." Ayla nodded, rising to prepare her pallet. But something had shifted between them, some final wall of isolation crumbling like the mountain ice in spring thaw. Their shared prayer hung in the air like a promise, more binding than any marshal's warning or preacher's false accusation. Outside, the stars emerged one by one as the clouds parted completely. Inside, 2 souls who had known only solitude learned what it meant to truly trust another human being as much as they trusted God. Morning crept over Thunder Ridge, the snow gleaming like crushed diamonds in the pale light. Joshua shouldered his trap bag, the familiar weight settling against his back as he made his way down slope. The marshal's visit yesterday still weighed heavy on his mind, but the trap lines wouldn't check themselves. Isla had insisted on coming with him, but he'd convinced her to stay behind. "Best you rest," he'd said. "Been through enough lately." Now, watching his boots break through the crusted snow, he wondered if he'd made the right choice, leaving her alone. The first two traps were empty, their mechanisms frozen shut. Joshua knocked the ice free and reset them, his movements automatic after years of practice. It was at the third trap, near where the creek bent around a granite outcropping, that he noticed something odd about the newly exposed bank. The melting snow had carved away a section of earth, revealing a thick streak of red clay. Joshua dropped to one knee, running his fingers over the rust-colored soil. The clay was dense, smooth as butter between his fingers, staining his skin a deep ochre. He'd seen this kind of earth before, when railroad men came through last spring, testing ground for iron deposits. "Iron rich," they'd called it, "worth its weight in gold to the right buyers." A memory surfaced, sharp and sudden as a thrown knife. 2 weeks ago, in town for supplies, he'd overheard men talking in the mercantile. Something about Reverend Kellen meeting with railroad representatives, discussing right-of-way purchases through the territory. Joshua's hand stilled on the clay bank. The pieces clicked together like a well-oiled rifle action. "Lord above," he whispered, staring at his red-stained fingers. He abandoned the trapline, hurrying back to the cabin. Ayla met him at the door, alarm crossing her face at his early return. "Joshua, what's wrong?" "Need to show you something." He grabbed an empty bucket from beside the door. "Come with me." They made their way carefully down the slope, Ayla holding his arm for balance on the slick ground. At the creek bank, Joshua pointed to the exposed clay vein. "Look here. What do you see?" Ayla knelt, touching the red earth hesitantly. "Clay. We used to dig something like this back home for dyeing cloth." "This ain't just any clay." Joshua began filling the bucket. "This is iron clay. Railroad companies pay good money for land with deposits like this. They use it for making steel." Ayla's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "And Reverend Kellen? He knew about this?" "Reckon so. Been meeting with railroad men talking about selling right-of-way through these parts." Joshua's jaw tightened. "Bet he didn't count on you overhearing anything that might spoil his plans." "I did hear something," Ayla whispered, her face paling. "The night before Nathan." She swallowed hard. "I was fetching water for the evening service. Reverend Kellen was talking to some men in suits behind the revival tent. Something about surveys and mineral rights. I didn't think anything of it at the time." Joshua nodded grimly. "That's why they're so set on discrediting you. Your word against theirs wouldn't mean much if you're branded a thief and attempted murderer." Ayla sank down on a fallen log, her hands trembling. "All this time I thought it was just Nathan's wounded pride driving them to hunt me. But this—" She gestured at the clay bank. "This is about money." "Money and power," Joshua agreed, securing the bucket's lid. "Two things that can turn even a man of God away from his calling." They worked together to fill a second bucket, the red clay heavy and cold. As they climbed back to the cabin, Ayla grew thoughtful. "Joshua," she said softly, Do you think maybe God led me here for a reason? Not just to escape, but because he knew someone needed to expose the truth?" Joshua couldn't answer right away. The question stirred something deep in his spirit, making him remember all the lonely years he'd spent on this ridge, wondering why God kept him here when other men his age had long since married and moved to more civilized places. They stored the clay buckets in the root cellar and prepared a simple supper of salt pork and cornbread. The cabin felt different now, charged with purpose rather than just survival. Ayla set their tin plates on the table with steady hands, her earlier fear replaced by quiet determination. "Even if it's true," she said, breaking the silence, "how can we prove any of it? It's still my word against theirs." "Clay speaks for itself," Joshua replied, cutting the cornbread. "And there might be others who've heard things, seen things. Truth has a way of gathering witnesses when God wills it." They ate without further discussion, but the air between them had changed. No longer were they simply fugitive and protector. They were partners in something larger, something that might require more courage than either had needed before. After supper, while Ayla washed the dishes, Joshua sat at his workbench near the fire. From a piece of seasoned pine, he began carving with slow, deliberate strokes. The wood was close-grained and sweet-smelling, taking the knife's edge cleanly. As the night wind rose outside, howling around the cabin's eaves like a wild thing, Joshua's hands remained steady. Bit by bit, a small cross emerged from the wood, simple but elegant, with smooth edges that caught the firelight. Ayla had already settled onto her pallet by the hearth, her breathing deep and even, when Joshua finished. He stood quietly, the cross warm in his palm from the working, and moved to place it beside her bed. The firelight caught the red clay still staining his fingers, making the wood's pale surface seem to glow where he touched it. For a moment, he stood looking down at her sleeping face, seeing not just the woman who had stumbled into his life, but a soul as earnestly seeking God's purpose as his own. The cross stood like a sentinel beside her, a small reminder that even in the wildest places, faith could take root and grow. Dawn broke clear the next morning, sunlight slicing through the storm clouds that had dominated the sky for weeks. Joshua stood on his porch, coffee cup steaming in his hands, watching the light paint the snow-covered ridge in shades of gold and rose. The air felt different, cleaner, calmer, like the pause between heartbeats. But something in that calm made the hair on his neck rise. Years in the mountains had taught him to read such signs. Fair weather after weeks of storm often meant worse weather brewing. He took another sip of coffee, tasting its bitter warmth, and wondered what other storms were gathering beyond his sight. The sound of Ayla stirring inside drew his attention. Through the window he saw her find the carved cross, watched her lift it with gentle hands. She held it to her heart for a long moment, then placed it carefully on the shelf above the hearth, where morning light made the pine wood gleam like honey. The morning sun pierced through thinning clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. Joshua stood on his porch, surveying the damage left by weeks of storms. Fallen branches littered the ground near the horse paddock, and snowdrifts had collapsed sections of the rail fence. "It'll need mending before spring," he muttered, pulling on his heavy work gloves. Ayla emerged from the cabin, wrapped in his mother's old shawl. "I can help," she offered, her breath clouding in the crisp air. "I'm stronger than I look." Joshua hesitated, but her determined expression made him nod. They worked together through the morning, clearing paths to the barn and digging out the horse trough. Ayla proved surprisingly capable with the shovel, matching his steady pace. "My father taught me to work before the revival took him," she explained, pausing to catch her breath. "Said idle hands made poor Christians." Joshua grunted in agreement, hefting a fallen branch. "My pa said much the same." By midday, they'd cleared most of the yard. The horses nickered gratefully when released from the barn, plowing through the snow to reach the hay Joshua spread. Ayla watched them with obvious delight, laughing when one nuzzled her pocket for treats. "First time I've heard you laugh," Joshua said quietly. Her smile faded slightly. "Been a while since I felt safe enough to." They worked on the fence next, Joshua showing her how to hold the rails steady while he hammered them back into place. The repetitive work settled into a comfortable rhythm, her steadying, him striking, moving down the line together. "Did you ever go to dances?" Ayla asked suddenly, breaking their companionable silence. "Back before—" She gestured vaguely at his solitary cabin. Joshua shook his head, focusing on the nail he was driving. "Ma wouldn't allow it. Said dancing led to improper thoughts. But surely not all dancing." Ayla set down her end of the rail, brushing snow from her skirts. "The Psalms speak of dancing before the Lord with joy." "Never learned the difference, I reckon," Joshua admitted. Ayla's eyes twinkled with sudden mischief. "Well then, it's high time you learned." She stepped back, holding out her hands. "Come here." "I don't think—" "It's just moving to music," she insisted. "And since we have none, we'll make our own." She began humming softly. "Amazing Grace, slow and sweet." Joshua stood frozen, hammer dangling from his fingers. Ayla waited patiently, hands still extended, until finally he set the tool down and stepped toward her. "Now put your hand here," she guided his right hand to her waist, "and hold mine with the other." Her fingers were warm, despite the cold air. "Just follow my steps, like walking but gentler." They moved awkwardly at first, boots crunching in the snow. Joshua stared at his feet, face flushed with concentration. But gradually, as Ayla's humming continued, he found the rhythm. Their circles grew smoother, more natural. "See?" Ayla smiled up at him. "You're dancing." Something loosened in Joshua's chest, a knot of rules and restrictions he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its weight. Here under the vast Colorado sky, with wind-swept snow swirling around their feet, dancing felt as natural as breathing. When they finally stopped, both slightly breathless, Ayla's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For making me feel human again, after everything. I'd forgotten what that felt like." They finished the fence repairs in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun warming their backs. As dusk approached, they retreated to the cabin's warmth. While Joshua built up the fire, Ayla noticed his rifle leaning in the corner, its barrel dusty from disuse. "May I?" she asked, reaching for it. At his nod, she took it down and began cleaning it with practiced hands. "Pa taught me this too. Said a clean rifle was next to godliness out here." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." Ayla's hands moved steadily over the weapon. "Had dreams for me beyond just surviving, though. Wanted me to get proper schooling." She paused, oil rag hovering over the barrel. "I always thought I might teach someday. Open a little school somewhere quiet, help children learn their letters and numbers." Joshua watched her work, imagination painting unexpected pictures. Ayla in a sunlit classroom, children gathered around her desk, spring breezes carrying their voices through open windows. His cabin didn't seem quite so lonely in that imagined future. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Joshua opened it to find a snow-dusted courier, red-faced from riding. "Telegraph for Joshua Boone," the man announced, extending a folded paper. "From Marshal Jensen. Required immediate delivery." Joshua's fingers trembled slightly as he accepted the message. The courier tipped his hat and rode away, leaving fresh tracks in the yard they'd just cleared. Ayla stood, rifle forgotten in her hands. "What does it say?" Joshua unfolded the paper, reading aloud. "Must appear before town council within 3 days, both parties, no exceptions. Signed, Marshal Jensen." Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackling fire. Ayla's knuckles whitened around the rifle stock. 3 days, she whispered. What will we do?" Joshua carefully tucked the telegram into his coat pocket. He crossed to where she stood and gently took the rifle, returning it to its corner. Then he faced her, his expression calm despite the storm of emotions behind it. "We'll do what's right," he said softly. "Let's walk toward truth, not away." Dawn painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and gold as Joshua stepped out into the crisp morning air. His breath formed clouds in the stillness as he made his way to the barn, boots crunching through fresh powder. Inside, his old mare Annie nickered softly at his approach. "Easy there, girl," he murmured, running a gentle hand down her neck. "Got ourselves a journey ahead." He worked methodically, checking each strap and buckle as he fitted the harness, then attached it to the small wagon they'd cleared of snow the previous evening. The familiar motions helped calm his racing thoughts, though his hands trembled slightly as he tightened the final cinch. Back in the cabin, Ayla moved with quiet purpose, wrapping cornbread and dried meat in clean cloth. She tucked Joshua's worn Bible carefully into her satchel, alongside the small wooden cross he'd carved. Her fingers lingered on its rough surface, drawing strength from the simple gift. "Ready?" Joshua asked from the doorway, his deep voice gentle. Ayla nodded, pulling his mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders. "As I'll ever be." They loaded the wagon in silence, securing their supplies against the rough journey ahead. Joshua helped Ayla up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her. The reins felt heavy in his hands as he clicked his tongue, urging Annie forward. The cabin grew smaller behind them as they wound their way down the snow-covered trail. Joshua's dogs followed for a while, then stopped at the property line, their howls echoing off the mountainside. He'd left them plenty of food, but their mournful chorus twisted something in his chest. The morning passed slowly as they picked their way through frozen passes. Annie's hooves found sure footing on the familiar path, her steady pace matching the rhythm of their hearts. Around midday, they stopped in a sheltered hollow to rest the horse and share a simple meal. "Reckon we'll make Miller's Creek by nightfall," Joshua said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "Good place to camp if you're willing." "I trust your judgment," Ayla replied softly. She sat close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, sharing warmth against the winter chill. The afternoon brought them through quiet valleys where skeletal trees stood sentinel against the pale sky. Ayla occasionally hummed hymns under her breath, the familiar melodies helping to ease their shared tension. Joshua found himself listening intently, drawing comfort from her clear voice. As the sun began to sink, they made camp in a protected bend of Miller's Creek. Joshua tended to Annie while Ayla gathered dry wood for a fire. The creek ran swift and dark beneath a thin sheet of ice, its whispered song a constant companion. "Never thought I'd be making this journey," Joshua admitted as they sat before the crackling flames. The firelight cast dancing shadows across their faces, making the wilderness beyond seem darker, more absolute. "Which part?" Ayla asked, wrapping her hands around a tin cup of hot tea. "The traveling or the company?" Joshua stared into the fire, his expression troubled. "Both, I reckon. Spent so many years alone up there, keeping to myself. Folks in town?" He paused, swallowing hard. "They already thought me strange. This'll give them more reason." "Because you chose to help someone in need?" "Because I've never—" He gestured vaguely, face flushing. "They mock what they don't understand. A man my age, never having known a woman's touch. They'll say I'm less than a man for it." Ayla set down her cup and turned to face him fully. "Joshua Boone, look at me." He met her gaze reluctantly, but her eyes held no judgment, only warmth. "Purity isn't weakness," she said firmly. "It's strength. The strength to stand by your convictions, to honor your promises, even when the world mocks them. That's not something to be ashamed of." Joshua's breath caught in his throat. "You truly believe that?" "I do." She reached across the space between them and squeezed his hand briefly. "And so does the Lord who sees your heart." They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the pop and hiss of green wood in the fire. Eventually, Ayla began to tell stories of her own childhood, happy memories of life before the revival ministry, when her father taught her to read by lamplight and her mother sang while kneading bread. As the fire burned low, they prepared for sleep. Joshua laid out their blankets near the dying embers, careful to maintain proper distance. Yet when the night's chill deepened, they found themselves shifting closer, sleeping back to back with blankets shared between them. The simple comfort of another's warmth made the wilderness feel less vast, less empty. Morning came too quickly, frost coating their blankets despite the fire's remnants. They ate a cold breakfast and set out as the sun crested the eastern peaks. The second day's journey took them down out of the mountains, the trail gradually widening into a proper road. Joshua noticed Ayla growing tenser as they descended, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When they stopped to water Annie at midday, he found her standing alone, staring down the valley toward their destination. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. She shook her head. "Not about telling the truth, just—" She wrapped her arms around herself, as if warding off a chill. "The preacher will be there. His son too, most likely. The thought of facing them again?" "You won't face them alone," Joshua said firmly. "Whatever comes, we'll meet it together." Ayla's smile was tremulous but genuine. "Thank you. For everything." They reached the valley road as evening approached. The winter sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and fading gold. Around a final bend, the lights of Clearwater appeared below them, warm windows glowing in the gathering dusk, smoke rising straight from chimneys in the still air. Ayla's breath quickened at the sight. Joshua felt her tension without looking, sensed the way her whole body seemed to brace against what awaited them. He drew Annie to a halt, letting them both take in the view. "Seems smaller than I remember," he mused, trying to ease her fear with casual observation. "How long since you've been down?" "Near 8 months, I reckon. Only come when supplies run low." Ayla's hand found his arm, gripping it tightly. "Joshua, what if they don't believe us? What if—" "Then we'll tell the truth anyway," he interrupted gently, covering her hand with his own, "and let heaven handle the rest." He felt some of the rigidity leave her shoulders at his words. They sat there a moment longer, watching the town's lights brighten against the deepening twilight. Then Joshua clicked his tongue, and Annie started forward again, carrying them down toward whatever justice, or mercy, awaited them in Clearwater. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Clearwater's main street as Joshua guided the wagon past the general store. Heads turned and conversations hushed. Women gathered on the boardwalk whispered behind gloved hands, while men paused their work to stare openly at the unlikely pair. "There's Joshua Boone," someone muttered. "The holy hermit himself." Another voice carried clearly. "That must be the preacher's runaway bride." Ayla sat straight-backed beside Joshua, her face composed despite the scrutiny. Her fingers worried the edge of his mother's shawl, but she held her chin high. Joshua felt a surge of pride at her quiet dignity. The livery stable stood at the far end of town, its weathered sign creaking in the evening breeze. Old Pete, the stable master, emerged from the shadowy interior, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man," Pete called out, his rheumy eyes taking in both travelers. "Heard tell you might be coming down?" Joshua climbed down from the wagon, then helped Ayla descend. "Evening, Pete. Need boarding for Annie and the wagon, and—" He cleared his throat. "Might you have that back room available?" Pete's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "The one behind the stable? Ain't much, but it's clean enough. 2 bits a night." "We'll take it," Joshua said firmly, pressing the coins into Pete's calloused palm. The room was indeed humble. A narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a 3-legged stool beneath a small window. But it was warm, and the straw tick mattress smelled fresh. Ayla set their few belongings on the stool, while Joshua brought in extra blankets from the wagon. Neither spoke of the sleeping arrangements. The bed was barely wide enough for one, let alone 2 who weren't truly married. "I'll make my bed on the floor," Joshua said quietly, spreading a blanket in the corner. Ayla opened her mouth to protest, but a knock at the door interrupted them. Joshua's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle before the marshal's familiar voice called out, "Evening, folks. Mind if I come in?" Joshua opened the door to find Marshal Davis standing there, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. The lawman removed his hat as he entered, revealing steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature. "Appreciate you coming in voluntarily," the marshal said, settling his bulk onto the stool. "Reverend Kellen's party arrived yesterday. They'll present their case at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." Joshua nodded. "And we'll have chance to speak our piece?" "That's why I'm here," Davis replied, pulling out a notebook. "Want to make sure everything's proper and fair. Judge Matthews is a good man. He'll hear both sides before making any ruling." For the next hour, the marshal took their statements, his pencil scratching across the paper as Ayla recounted the events at the revival camp. Her voice trembled only slightly when describing how the preacher's son had cornered her after she fled the wedding tent. "He said no one would believe me," she whispered, "that his father would make sure I was blamed for everything." The marshal's weathered face remained neutral, but his jaw tightened. When he finished writing, he stood and replaced his hat. "Get some rest," he advised. "Tomorrow won't be easy, but truth has a way of coming out." He paused at the door. "And Boone? You did right by her, whatever folks might say." After the marshal left, silence filled the small room. Through the thin walls came the sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, the occasional stamp of hooves against wooden floors. Ayla moved to the window, staring out at the deepening dusk. "I never thought I'd have to see him again," she said softly. "In my nightmares, he's always there, reaching for me with those burning hands." Joshua crossed the room in 2 strides. For the first time since finding her in the snow, he deliberately took her hands in his. They were small within his calloused grip, but strong, hands that had known both work and grace. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have nothing to fear while I stand beside you. Nothing at all." Ayla's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away. "Why do you risk so much for me? Your reputation, your peace?" "Because it's right," Joshua answered simply. "And because you showed me that living God's truth means more than just keeping myself pure. It means standing up for those who need protection." They stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped in the gathering darkness, until the church bells rang the evening hour. Joshua reluctantly stepped back, aware of how improper their closeness might appear. "We should rest," he said, moving to his blanket on the floor. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." They took turns at the washstand, preparing for bed with careful courtesy. Ayla slipped beneath the covers, while Joshua banked the small stove. Neither slept much that night, both lost in thoughts of what morning would bring. Dawn arrived clear and cold, sunlight streaming through frost-covered window panes. They dressed in their best clothes, Joshua in his father's old suit, Isla in a clean dress she'd mended by lamplight during their days in the cabin. She helped Joshua. With his necktie, her fingers steady despite her obvious nervousness. The church bells began tolling 10 o'clock as they stepped out into the crisp morning air. Joshua offered his arm, and Ayla took it without hesitation. Together they walked down the boardwalk toward the courthouse, their boots echoing in unison on the wooden planks. "The Lord is my shepherd," Ayla murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I shall not want," Joshua continued, matching her quiet tone. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Back and forth they traded verses, drawing strength from the familiar words and each other's presence. Townsfolk lined the street, watching their progress with undisguised curiosity. Joshua kept his eyes forward, his spine straight despite the weight of judgment in those stares. The courthouse stood at the town center, its white-painted columns stark against the winter-blue sky. On the steps, Marshal Davis waited with Judge Matthews, both men solemn in their dark coats. Through the windows, Joshua glimpsed movement, the preacher's party already assembled inside. Ayla's grip tightened on his arm as they climbed the steps. Joshua covered her hand with his free one, offering what comfort he could. "He restoreth my soul," she whispered, her final prayer before they crossed the threshold. "He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake," Joshua finished, and together they stepped into the courthouse to face whatever justice awaited them. The courtroom's heavy oak doors groaned as Joshua and Ayla entered. Every head turned, and the whispers began like rustling leaves. The room smelled of wood polish and tension, packed tight with townsfolk eager for the morning's drama. Reverend Kellen sat in the front row, his silver hair catching the winter sunlight that streamed through tall windows. His son Nathan hunched beside him, arm bandaged, face drawn with what looked like pain, or perhaps fear. Joshua guided Ayla to a bench on the opposite side, keeping himself between her and their accusers. Judge Matthews settled behind his desk, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "This hearing will now commence," he announced, his voice carrying authority without harshness. "Marshal Davis, please present the accusations." The marshal stood, reading from his notebook. "Charges have been brought against Miss Ayla Carver for assault with intent to harm, theft of ministry funds, and fleeing justice. Additional charges of harboring a fugitive may apply to Joshua Boone." "Reverend Kellen, you may speak first," the judge directed. The preacher rose slowly, straightening his black coat. His voice, when it came, held all the practiced resonance of his pulpit delivery. "Your Honor, my heart is heavy today. This young woman was like a daughter to me, raised in our ministry since childhood. We gave her everything: education, spiritual guidance, a future with my own son." He turned to face the crowd, hands spread wide. "But Satan finds his way into even the most innocent hearts. She betrayed our trust, seduced my Nathan on the very day of their intended wedding, then attacked him with a broken lantern when he refused her advances. She fled with our ministry's traveling funds, money meant for God's work, for bringing His word to isolated communities." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Joshua felt Ayla trembling beside him, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "Nathan," the Reverend continued, gesturing to his son, "show the court your wounds." Nathan stood awkwardly, unwrapping the bandage to reveal angry red burns along his forearm. "She came to me that night," he said, voice quavering. Said she wanted to be with me before the wedding. When I told her we must wait, she grew angry, broke the lantern, and—" He let the sentence trail off, looking down. "And now we find her living in sin with this—" Reverend Kellen's lip curled slightly as he regarded Joshua. "This mountain hermit, who claims a false marriage to shield her crimes." The preacher's followers nodded and muttered agreement. Someone hissed "Jezebel" from the back of the room. Joshua's fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white, but he kept silent, waiting. "Marshal Davis," Judge Matthews called, "please summon Joshua Boone to speak." Joshua squeezed Ayla's hand before rising. He walked to the front of the courtroom, aware of every creak of his boots on the wooden floor. Standing before the judge, he cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I ain't much for public speaking," he began quietly. "I live alone up on Thunder Ridge. Try to walk right with God and stay out of folks' business. But 5 nights ago, my dog started barking at dusk. Found this young woman collapsed in the snow, bleeding, half frozen to death." He described how he'd carried her inside, tended her wounds, given her shelter. "When she woke, she told me about running from—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "From a man who tried to force himself on her. Said she'd fought back with the only weapon she had, a broken lantern." Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Joshua continued. "When riders came looking, something in my spirit said they meant her harm. So yes, I lied. Said she was my wife to protect her. If that's a crime, then I'll bear the punishment. But I've seen no evidence of theft, no sign of the person they describe. Just a frightened young woman who needed help." The crowd's murmurs took on a different tone. Several people were studying Nathan's face now, noting how he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. "You expect us to believe," Reverend Kellen interrupted, "that you took in a strange woman, shared your home with her, yet never—" He let the implication hang heavy in the air. "I made a promise to my dying mother," Joshua answered steadily, "to keep myself pure until proper marriage. I've never broken that vow, not even now." Something in his simple dignity made even the preacher fall silent for a moment. Judge Matthews leaned forward, studying both men. "These are serious allegations on both sides," he said finally. "Before rendering judgment, I require verification of certain claims. Marshal Davis will investigate the ministry's financial records and interview witnesses from the revival camp. Until then, Miss Carver will remain in Mr. Boone's custody, given their claimed marriage status. Court will reconvene in 3 days' time." He struck his gavel, and the crowd began to disperse. As Joshua helped Ayla to her feet, Reverend Kellen's men brushed past them roughly. One spat on the floor near their feet, muttering "whore" under his breath. Joshua's arm shot out instinctively, but Ayla caught his wrist. "Don't," she whispered. "It's what they want." Instead, he removed his coat and held it up like a shield, protecting her from their hateful stares as they made their way outside. The winter air felt clean after the stuffy courtroom, but offered little comfort. They walked back to their room in silence, both lost in thought. Only when the door closed behind them did Ayla finally break down, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "How can they twist everything so wrong?" she choked out. "Make truth sound like lies, and lies sound like truth." Joshua stood awkwardly, wanting to comfort her but unsure how. "Evil works that way sometimes," he said softly. "Wraps itself in righteous words until folk can't see clear anymore." As evening settled over the town, they shared a simple meal of bread and dried meat. Neither had much appetite. The room grew dark except for their single candle, its flame casting long shadows on the walls. "We should pray," Ayla said finally, straightening her shoulders. "Not for escape this time, for truth to be seen, no matter what it costs us." Joshua nodded, and they knelt together beside the narrow bed, Their voices mingled in the darkness, asking not for safety or comfort, but for justice to prevail, for light to shine in dark places, for courage to face whatever came next. "Amen," they whispered together, and in that moment something shifted between them, a deeper trust, a shared purpose, stronger than fear. Outside, the town settled into night. Dogs barked in distant yards, and somewhere a child's laughter drifted on the cold air. Joshua and Ayla sat in companionable silence, watching their candle burn low, waiting for dawn and whatever truth it might bring. Dawn painted Clearwater's main street in pale gold as townspeople hurried through their morning chores. Joshua stood at the window of their rented room, watching merchants unlock their shops while worry gnawed at his gut. Behind him, Ayla plaited her hair with trembling fingers. "Court reconvenes in an hour," she said softly. "Do you think anyone else will speak for us?" Before Joshua could answer, hoofbeats echoed from the street below. He leaned closer to the glass, recognition lighting his face. "Well, I'll be..." A tall rider on a paint horse trotted down the street, his dark hair bound with a beaded band, his bearing proud but humble. Several townspeople nodded respectfully as he passed, unusual deference for a native man in a settler town. "Henry," Joshua breathed. "Henry Tall Elk." "Who is he?" Ayla asked, joining him at the window. "A friend. Maybe the truest one I've got." Joshua grabbed his coat. "Stay here. I need to speak with him." He took the stairs 2 at a time, emerging onto the street just as Henry dismounted. The Ute Scout's weathered face broke into a gentle smile. "Joshua Boone," he said, extending his hand. "Word reached the agency about your trouble." Joshua clasped his friend's hand warmly. "Been 3 winters since that hunting dispute. Still don't know how I can repay you for speaking truth then." "Perhaps today I repay you." Henry's dark eyes held meaning. "I was tracking elk near Thunder Ridge 5 nights past. Saw things that need telling." Joshua's heart quickened. "Will you speak before the judge?" Henry nodded solemnly. "Truth honors both our peoples. I will speak." When they entered the courthouse an hour later, the room fell silent. Henry's presence commanded attention, not through force, but through the quiet dignity he carried. He sat straight-backed in the gallery, while Judge Matthews called the session to order. Reverend Kellen and his son took their usual places, the preacher's face tightening when he spotted Henry. Before he could speak, Marshal Davis stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have a witness who's come forward, Henry Tall Elk, known to this court as a trusted interpreter and scout for the territory." The judge nodded. "Please approach, Mr. Tall Elk." Henry rose smoothly and walked to the front, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. He raised his right hand and swore the oath with careful precision. "Tell us what you witnessed on the night in question," the judge directed. Henry's voice carried clearly through the hushed room. "I was tracking winter elk along Thunder Ridge. The moon was bright on snow. Near midnight I heard screaming." The crowd leaned forward. Even the bailiff stood straighter. "I saw a woman running through trees. Behind her, a man with knife." Henry's steady gaze fell on Nathan Kellen. This man. He shouted things no man should say to woman. She had torn dress, bleeding arm. When she broke lantern to defend herself, he caught fire. She ran north toward mountains. He returned to camp, cursing. Nathan's face had gone chalk white. The Reverend half rose. "Your Honor, this is..." "Silence," Judge Matthews ordered. "Continue, Mr. Tall Elk." I followed her tracks until dawn, making sure she reached safety. They led to Joshua Boone's cabin. I know him as honest man who once stood for my people when others would not listen. When I saw she found shelter there, I left her to God's care. Henry's testimony hung in the air like smoke, The preacher's supporters shifted uncomfortably. Several women were weeping softly. "Why did you not come forward sooner?" the judge asked. "I was called to agency business at Dawn Creek. Only heard of arrest yesterday." Henry's eyes met Joshua's. "I came as soon as I could." The judge removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly. "Marshal Davis, approach the bench." The two men spoke in low tones. Finally, the judge straightened. "Given this new testimony from a trusted witness, I am ordering a full re-examination of all evidence and statements. Marshal, you will re-interview every member of the revival camp, separately this time. You have my authority to investigate the ministry's records thoroughly." He turned to the gallery. "This court will recess until all facts are properly established. Miss Carver will remain in Mr. Boone's custody." His gavel cracked like thunder. Ayla buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent tears. Joshua gripped her fingers tightly, his own eyes burning with emotion. Around them, the crowd buzzed with whispered conversation. Reverend Kellen and his son hurried from the courthouse, no longer carrying themselves with such righteous certainty. As the room cleared, Marshal Davis approached Joshua and Ayla, touching the brim of his hat. "Seems Truth rode in this morning," he said quietly, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. He nodded to Henry, who stood nearby. "Much obliged for your testimony, Mr. Tall Elk." After the marshal left, Henry clasped Joshua's shoulder. "I must return to the agency. Creator guide your path, my friend." "Wait." Ayla stepped forward, voice trembling. "Thank you for speaking truth when so few would." Henry bowed slightly. "Truth needs no thanks. It simply is." With that, he turned and walked out into the morning light. Joshua and Ayla emerged into a town that felt somehow different. The hostile stares had turned uncertain. Several women who'd previously shunned them offered small nods. The general store owner pressed a paper of peppermint drops into Ayla's hands, muttering, "No charge," before hurrying away. They walked arm in arm back to their room, winter sunshine warm on their faces. The weight of false accusation had not fully lifted, but truth had cracked its foundation. They could breathe again, wait with hope, while justice took its course. Henry's paint horse clattered past as they reached the boarding house steps. The Ute Scout raised one hand in farewell before disappearing down the valley road, his work of truth-telling complete. Behind him, he left a town grappling with its conscience and two grateful hearts, finding their way toward freedom. By early afternoon, winter sunlight streamed through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The room had filled beyond capacity, with townspeople standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. Even the children who usually played in the street had pressed their faces against the window panes, breath fogging the glass. Judge Matthews adjusted his spectacles, shuffling through the papers Marshal Davis had placed before him. The scratch of his pen seemed to echo in the hushed chamber. Joshua sat straight-backed beside Ayla, his calloused hand resting protectively near hers on the rough-hewn table. Nathan Kellen shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, his bandaged arm cradled against his chest. The young man's face had lost its arrogant mask, replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. His father, Reverend Kellen, sat rigid in the front row, knuckles white where they gripped his Bible. "Nathan Kellen?" Judge Matthews began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You've asked to make a statement to this court. Proceed." Nathan swallowed hard, avoiding his father's burning gaze. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and started again. "I need to speak truth before God and man." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Joshua felt Ayla tense beside him. "The charges against Miss Carver are false," Nathan continued, each word seeming to pain him. "She didn't attack me without cause. He paused, touching his bandaged arm. I tried to force myself on her. When she refused my advances, I became violent. The lantern broke in her struggle to defend herself. Gasps and whispers filled the room. Several of the minister's followers stood up and walked out, heads bowed in shame. Furthermore, Nathan's voice grew stronger, as if unburdening his soul gave him courage. My father knew the truth. He convinced me to lie because of the railroad survey. The judge leaned forward. Explain. The revival ministry owns land options throughout the territory. Father learned that valuable clay deposits were discovered, clay the railroad needs for their construction. Nathan glanced at his father, who had gone deathly pale. He knew Miss Carver had overheard discussions about the land deals. When she refused to marry me and fled, he saw a chance to discredit her before she could speak out. Reverend Kellen surged to his feet. You ungrateful. Silence! Judge Matthews's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Reverend Kellen, sit down, or I'll have you removed. He turned back to Nathan. Continue. That's all, Your Honor. Nathan's shoulders slumped. I've carried this shame long enough. I ask the court's mercy, and... He looked directly at Ayla for the first time. I ask Miss Carver's forgiveness, though I don't deserve it. The judge removed his spectacles, polishing them deliberately while he considered. The room remained perfectly still, waiting. Given this testimony and the evidence presented by Marshal Davis, I hereby dismiss all charges against Miss Ayla Carver. The gavel fell with finality. Furthermore, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into the Revival Ministry's land dealings. Reverend Kellen, surrender your papers to the marshal. As if a spell had broken, the remaining members of the minister's congregation began filing out, many openly weeping. Reverend Kellen stood alone, his authority crumbling like dust. Miss Carver, Judge Matthews said more gently, you are free to go. This court offers its sincere apologies for your ordeal. Ayla's tears fell freely now. Joshua helped her stand, supporting her trembling form. As they turned to leave, Marshal Davis approached with a small smile. Justice may be slow sometimes, he said quietly, but she usually finds her way home. They emerged onto the boardwalk to find the afternoon had turned bright and cold. Townspeople who had witnessed the proceedings gathered around them, offering handshakes and awkward apologies. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, pressed a wrapped loaf of fresh bread into Ayla's hands. The general store owner insisted they take a basket of provisions on the house. Even gruff old Mr. Peterson, who had previously cursed them in the street, muttered a rough, sorry folks, before hurrying away. The first snowflakes began to fall, soft and silent, catching in Ayla's hair like stars. Joshua watched them melt against her cheeks, struck by how beautiful she looked in that moment, no longer afraid, no longer running. His heart swelled with something deeper than protection, stronger than duty. Do you still want to keep your vow? Ayla whispered, her eyes meeting his with sudden vulnerability. Joshua felt the weight of his mother's words, the promise he'd made so long ago. But now he understood it differently, not as a chain, but as preparation for this very moment. Maybe the vow was never to stay alone, he said softly, but to wait for what was pure. The falling snow seemed to hush the whole world as Joshua slowly knelt on the wooden boardwalk. Several women gasped. Someone dropped a basket. But Joshua saw only Ayla, her eyes wide with wonder. Ayla Carver. His voice shook slightly, but grew stronger with each word. God brought you to my gate that night, and every day since has shown me why. You've taught me that true purity isn't about isolation. It's about love given in faith and truth. He took her small hand in his rough ones. Will you be my wife before God and man? Tears froze on Ayla's cheeks as she smiled through them. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, joy breaking through like sunshine. "Yes." The gathered townspeople broke into cheers and applause. Mrs. Henderson was openly weeping into her apron. Even Marshal Davis, watching from the courthouse steps, wore a broad grin. The snow continued to fall, transforming the muddy street into something clean and new. Joshua stood and drew Ayla close, their first embrace witnessed by the whole town. But they saw only each other, two souls who had found their way through darkness into light, guided by faith and bound now by love that was pure and true. Snow crunched beneath carriage wheels as wagons and riders made their way up the winding path to the mountain chapel. The small white building perched above Clearwater like a dove's nest, its spire reaching toward the crystal-clear winter sky. Inside, morning sunlight streamed through frosted windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. Joshua stood before the chapel's stone hearth, tugging at the collar of his borrowed suit coat. It felt strange after years of buckskin and homespun wool. Henry Tall Elk, standing nearby in his finest beaded vest, noticed his friend's nervousness and placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Brother," Henry said softly, "your heart beats like a young deer's. Be still. The Creator's blessing rests here today." Joshua managed a shaky smile. "Much obliged, Henry. Just never thought I'd see such a day." The chapel doors opened, letting in a rush of cold air as more townspeople filed in. Joshua recognized faces that had sneered at him mere days ago, now wearing expressions of genuine warmth. Mrs. Henderson bustled down the aisle, directing her sons as they carried baskets of fresh bread and preserves for the celebration to come. Mr. Peterson and his wife found seats near the front, the old man's usually stern face softened with something like contentment. Marshal Davis entered, wearing his badge but carrying a Bible instead of his usual sidearm. He nodded to Joshua and took his place before the altar. Though not officially ordained, the marshal had authority to perform marriages in the territory. More importantly, he had earned the right to join these two souls, whose truth he had helped uncover. The chapel filled quickly. Settlers in their Sunday best sat shoulder to shoulder with Henry's Ute kinsmen, who had traveled down from their winter camps to honor the Union. Children whispered and pointed at the cedar boughs and pine garlands that Mrs. Henderson's daughters had woven to decorate the bare walls. A hush fell over the gathering as violin music drifted through the open door. Young Tommy Baker, the store owner's son, drew his bow across the strings with surprising grace, playing an old hymn that Joshua's mother had often sung. The congregation rose as one, turning toward the entrance. Ayla appeared in the doorway, and Joshua's breath caught in his throat. She wore a simple dress of deep blue wool, borrowed from the marshal's wife, with sprigs of evergreen pinned at her shoulder. Her hair fell in soft waves beneath a crown of winter berries. But it was her eyes that held him, clear and bright, shining with joy instead of fear. This was not the frightened girl who had collapsed at his gate, but a woman who had found her strength through trial and grace. As she walked down the aisle, Joshua remembered that first night, how he had carried her broken body through the snow, praying desperately for her life. Now she walked toward him of her own accord, each step bringing them closer to a future neither had imagined possible. When she reached his side, Ayla's small hand slipped into his larger one. Her fingers were warm despite the chapel's chill. Marshal Davis opened his Bible, the leather creaking in the hushed room. "Dearly beloved," he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner. "We gather here to witness not just a marriage, but a miracle of God's providence. Through darkness and storm, through false accusation and true justice, these two souls have found their way to each other's light. Joshua's vision blurred as the marshal spoke of faith tested and proven, of love born in adversity's forge. Ayla's hand tightened in his as tears slipped down her cheeks. Before the exchange of vows, Henry Tall Elk stepped forward. In his hands he held a necklace of carved cedar beads, each one shaped and polished to a warm glow. "Among my people," Henry said, his quiet voice commanding attention. "Cedar is sacred. It wards off evil and draws down blessing." He placed the necklace over Ayla's bowed head. "These beads carry prayers for protection, that no harm will touch this union born of truth." Ayla touched the beads with trembling fingers. "Thank you, Henry," she whispered. The scout stepped back, inclining his head in blessing. Marshal Davis turned to Joshua. "The rings?" Joshua reached into his pocket with unsteady hands, withdrawing a simple gold band. He had traded his father's pocket watch to the jeweler in Clearwater, knowing his parents would have approved of such an exchange. The metal caught the sunlight as he held it. "Repeat after me," the marshal instructed. "With this ring." Joshua's voice shook as he spoke the ancient words, sliding the band onto Ayla's finger. Her own voice was clear and strong as she made the same promises, placing a matching ring on his hand. The metal felt strange but right, like a completion of something long unfinished. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Marshal Davis proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Before he could tell Joshua to kiss his bride, Ayla rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. A few chuckles rippled through the congregation, quickly followed by applause. Joshua held her close, tasting the salt of joyful tears. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, Tommy Baker drew his bow across the violin strings once more. The congregation rose, and the first notes of "Be Thou My Vision" filled the chapel. Joshua remembered his mother singing this very hymn while she worked, her voice carrying across their homestead. Now dozens of voices joined together, settler and Ute alike, lifting the ancient words to the rafters. "Be Thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, naught be all else to me, save that Thou art Thou my best thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, Thy presence my light." The singing followed them out into the churchyard, where tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family. Steam rose from huge pots of venison stew, courtesy of Henry's hunting party. Mrs. Henderson's bread disappeared as quickly as she could slice it. Children darted between the adults' legs, snatching cookies and dodging playful swats. Joshua and Ayla moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and sharing their meal. The atmosphere was unlike anything Joshua had known in his years of solitude. Here was community in its truest form, not forced or false, but freely given in love and repentance. As the winter sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in rose and gold, the celebration slowly wound down. Families gathered their empty dishes and sleepy children, heading down the mountain before full dark. Henry's people melted away into the forest with quiet blessings. Mrs. Henderson pressed a basket of leftovers into Ayla's hands, while Mr. Peterson surprised them both with the gift of a handmade quilt. Finally, Joshua helped Ayla into their wagon, tucking blankets around her against the evening chill. As they started the familiar trail home, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting began appearing in the darkening sky. The cabin windows glowed with welcome, just as they had that stormy night when Joshua had carried an unconscious stranger across his threshold. Now he lifted his bride down from the wagon, her laughter ringing across the snow-covered yard. His dogs bounded around them, tails wagging in recognition of their expanded family. Joshua took the lamp from its hook and held it high, illuminating the cabin's door. The same door that had once opened to desperation now swung wide to joy. Isla paused beside him, her face glowing in the lamplight. "Welcome home," Joshua whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Home," Ayla echoed, reaching for his hand. Together they stepped across the threshold, leaving fear behind and walking into warmth, into belonging, into love made pure by trial and true by grace. Inside, the hearth fire cast dancing shadows on the walls where cedar boughs now hung. The cabin that had known such loneliness now held the promise of shared songs, shared prayers, shared life. As Joshua set the lamp in its window, its light reached out across the snow, no longer a beacon for lost souls, but a testament to souls found, redeemed, and joined as one. The mountain air softened as winter released its grip on Thunder Ridge. Patches of bare earth emerged from beneath melting snow, dark and rich with possibility. Morning sunlight caught the droplets falling from icicles along the cabin's eaves, each one sparkling like a tiny prayer answered. Joshua stood on the cabin roof, replacing weather-worn shingles with fresh-cut boards. His movements were steady and sure, each nail driven home with practiced precision. From this height, he could see the valley stretching below, where spring fought winter for dominance in a patchwork of snow and emerging green. Below, in the newly cleared garden plot, Ayla worked the soil with careful attention. Her hands, once soft from revival camp life, had grown strong and certain with mountain living. She had sectioned off neat rows with twine, marking places for herbs, vegetables, and flowers. The earth seemed to welcome her touch, as if it too had waited for someone to tend it with love. "The soil's good here," she called up to Joshua. "Better than I expected for mountain ground." He paused in his work, smiling down at her. "My mother always said the Lord blessed this hollow special. Everything she planted seemed to thrive." Ayla brushed dirt from her apron and straightened, one hand shading her eyes as she looked up at him. "Then we'll honor her memory by bringing it back to life." Inside the cabin, beside the stone hearth where they had first found trust in each other, stood Joshua's newest creation, a cradle carved from mountain pine. He had worked on it in secret during the cold evenings, his knife finding shapes in the wood that spoke of hope and welcome. The curved headboard bore delicate patterns of leaves and vines, while the rockers underneath promised gentle motion. It sat empty now, but its presence filled the cabin with quiet anticipation. As afternoon stretched toward evening, travelers appeared on the trail, a Ute family Joshua had known for years, leading pack horses laden with goods to trade. Where once he might have hidden from such visits, Joshua now walked out to greet them warmly, Isla at his side. "Brother," the eldest man said, clasping Joshua's hand, "we bring news and goods from the valley." His wife and daughters spread out blankets displaying beadwork, dried herbs, and tanned hides. Ayla brought out coffee and fresh-baked bread, serving everyone as they sat in the spring sunshine. The Ute women admired her garden preparations, offering advice about planting with the moon cycles. Their children played with Joshua's dogs, their laughter echoing off the mountainside. Trading was unhurried, wrapped in stories and fellowship. Joshua offered fresh meat and wood carvings, while Ayla traded her preserved fruits and mended clothing. More than goods changed hands, wisdom passed between cultures, friendship deepened, and the lonely ridge grew richer with human bonds. As the sun began to set, their guests departed with promises to return when the summer berries ripened. Joshua and Ayla stood watching until the riders disappeared around the bend, their dogs lounging contentedly at their feet. It's different now, Joshua said softly. This place used to be so quiet it hurt. Ayla squeezed his hand. The quiet's still here. It's just peaceful now, not lonely. They moved inside as evening shadows lengthened across the ridge. Ayla lit the lamp that had guided them through so many changes, its familiar glow warming the cabin's heart. She began humming as she prepared their supper, an old lullaby she remembered from childhood, before the revival camp had twisted sacred things with fear. Joshua paused in his work of banking the fire, listening. The melody touched something deep in his spirit, calling forth memories of his mother singing as she worked. Slowly, hesitantly, he added his voice to Ayla's, finding the harmony as naturally as spring found winter's end. Ayla turned to him in surprise and joy, her eyes bright in the lamplight. Their voices twined together, filling the cabin with music that spoke of hope fulfilled and love finally found. The empty cradle seemed to rock slightly in the firelight, as if already practicing its future purpose. Later, as night settled over Thunder Ridge, they knelt together beside their bed. The same bed where Joshua had once laid a half-frozen stranger, never dreaming she would become his wife. Their prayer rose simple and sincere, giving thanks for mercy that had turned fear to faith, loneliness to love, and isolation to belonging. "Lord," Joshua whispered, his voice thick with gratitude, "you knew better than I did what my vow really meant. Thank you for teaching me that purity isn't about staying untouched. It's about touching life with clean hands and an honest heart." Ayla added her own thanks, her fingers intertwined with his. "Thank you for leading me to this mountain, this home, this man. Thank you for turning my running away into running home." Outside their window, the peaks stood silver in the starlight, their snow-covered flanks gleaming like guardians. The spring thaw sent streams of melting snow singing down the ridges, nature's own hymn of renewal. Inside, the lamp burned low as the fire settled to coals. Ayla rested her head on Joshua's shoulder, her breathing growing slow and peaceful. He held her gently, this precious gift he had never thought to receive. The man who had once built walls against love now cradled it in his arms, as natural as breathing, as right as spring following winter. The empty cradle waited by the hearth, patient as prayer. The garden soil lay ready for planting. The cabin that had once echoed with one man's solitude now hummed with shared life. Through the window, the mountains kept their ancient watch, while inside, love made its home in the hearts that had waited so long to find it. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.